Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Lyle. I'm the chairman of the Urban Reform Institute in Houston, Texas, and I'm honored this morning to welcome everyone to our joint presentation of Ownership and Opportunity by the Urban Reform Institute and the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas. This is a study that's been in the works for close to 2 years, and it basically originated from an ongoing conversation with Cullum Clark at the Bush Institute. And it's basically a follow-on to our 2018 study, Policies to Promote Inclusive Urban Growth with the Bush Institute. And in spite of a pandemic, a crazy election year, and some technical difficulties this morning, we finally got to the finish line, and we're happy to be here this morning. Before I get started with formal introductions and acknowledgments, I wanted to share a little bit about my background and how I got involved in the Urban Reform Institute. I own a company that specializes in the development of retail shopping centers in Texas and surrounding states. And our business model is pretty simple. We form relationships with retailers. We help them identify locations to develop new stores. We acquire land, build buildings, and we hope to repeat that process as many times as possible with the same retailer. And we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 20 years, but none more important than there's just some municipalities that are more expensive to build in than others. We're basically duplicating the same building in multiple locations, and it's not uncommon for development costs to increase by as much as 40% in different municipalities. Sometimes that's a result of obligations to use labor unions or labor shortages in certain markets or other special situations. But most commonly, it's the direct impact of zoning laws and draconian development requirements, which ultimately result in increased costs and occupancy costs for the tenants. At the end of the day, these increased occupancy costs have a direct impact on what these retailers can charge for the goods and services. Prior to meeting Joel Kotkin in 2015, it seemed like a huge stretch to me that the same type of development requirements and zoning regulations could have such a negative impact on the middle class and or really have a direct negative impact on upward mobility. That was until I spent 15 minutes with Joel. I was introduced to Joel by a group of Houston businessmen that had recently formed a think tank called the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. And their sole focus was affordable home ownership for the upwardly mobile. It was really refreshing for me to hear at the time that states like California or New York could learn something about the way we develop in Houston and other cities in Texas that directly benefit from less regulation, lower taxes, et cetera. It's really amazing to me how quickly the national narrative is turning. And there's a direct correlation between this turn in the narrative and Joel and his team's relentless pursuit of affordable home ownership for the masses. In 2020, we merged the Center for Opportunity Urbanism with Charles Blaine's Urban Reform Platform. We ultimately rebranded the center as the Urban Reform Institute to help better utilize our resources and hopefully increase our exposure both locally and nationally. Today's presentation would not be possible without Joel's amazing team of fellows, Ann Snyder, Wendell Cox, and Tori Gaddis, and also contributing authors, Carla Del Rio Lopez, Pete Saunders, and his research assistant, Alicia Karemska. And I can't proceed without mentioning Cullum Clark of the George W. Bush Institute, who's also a co-author and trusted friend and supporter of the Urban Reform Institute. Additionally, I'd like to thank our major donors for the project, Ted Nelson of Newland Communities, Joel Farkas of Gateway American Resources, Mark Boyce of True Homes, and Southern Methodist University and the Bush Institute. We're really hopeful that today's presentation will be thought-provoking and helps each of you think a little differently about regulation and affordable homeownership. With that, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. And thanks for your introduction. I think it's having you as chairman has led us through a great year, and I'm excited for what we can accomplish this next year. And thank you everyone for joining us. And as Tom said, my name is Charles Blaine, and I'm president of Urban Reform and Urban Reform Institute. And I want to give all the credit for this event and for this report to and for all of the work that we do and how impactful it is to my colleagues. As Tom mentioned, Tori Gadd is founding senior fellow with Urban Reform Institute, and you can also find more of his writing over at his site, Houston Strategies. Wendell Cox, also founding senior fellow with Urban Reform Institute, and obviously Joel Kotkin, who's going to be moderating our discussions today. And he serves as executive director for the Institute and also runs the New Geography website. And I'd also like to thank our board, Tom, our chairman, who has led us through a great year, and I hope will continue to do so. Leo Lindbeck, Dick Weekly, Alan Hassenflew, Walt Misher, and Larry Johnson. At URI, our goal is to promote policies that produce and protect upward mobility, whether that's through our signature report, the Upward Mobility Index, which was released last month and can be found at urbanreforminstitute.org, or our other research projects like the one we're here to discuss today, Ownership and Opportunity. Upward mobility underpins most of what we do. And what we'll hear today from panelists is how we're seeing limited opportunities for home ownership across the spectrum, but importantly, its impact on low-income Americans, minorities, immigrants, and millennials. Home ownership has been a critical source of advancement for the middle class, with housing costs being such a large driver of overall cost of living. Having housing that is affordable ensures that everyone has the opportunity to live and thrive where they choose. And that's something I think Wendell often talks about is how much housing contributes to the cost of living. And I hope he'll talk a little bit about that today because of the importance of it. So what we're discussing today is a fresh policy agenda that can breathe new life into the American dream and protect middle class standards of living. This agenda should prioritize new housing supply at all price points, and particularly growing in growing and high opportunity places. I encourage you to visit urbanreforminstitute.org following the presentation to learn more about the report and the work that we do. There you can find all of our work and all of our publications, and you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. And if you're so inclined, you can contribute to the work that we do. With that said, I don't want to take too much time because I really do want to give it to Joel and the panelists to be able to discuss and have a robust conversation about this report and the work that they're doing. So as I previously mentioned, Joel serves as the executive director for the Urban Reform Institute, and he'll be moderating our panels today. For those who are unfamiliar with Joel and his work, he's a presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University and the author of 10 books. And you can regularly find him in City Journal, Tablet, the LA Times, American Mind, Daily Beast, and obviously Urban Reform Institute. So with that, I'll hand it over to Joel, and we'll promote our panelists back up here from attendees, and we can get started.
First of all, thanks to Charles for trying to put this technological extravaganza together. What I'd like to do is just turn it over for initial sort of summary to the primary authors, Cullum Clark and Ann Snyder. The introductions will be short. Cullum is at the George Bush Presidential Library and in the Bush Center, works a lot on opportunity issues, and also teaches at SMU. Ann Snyder has been worked with us for a long time, and she's done a lot of our work on millennials. We felt that having somebody who, well, at least she's in shouting distance of being a millennial, whereas many of us are at best shouting distance of our children who are millennials. So I think she brings a really good perspective, and that's true even though she lives in Washington D.C. She's also the editor-in-chief of Comment magazine, and I understand she's spending a lot of time trying to go back and forth to Toronto in the midst of a pandemic, which is probably not fun. So with that, let me open it up. Cullum, you want to start, and then you'll turn it over to Ann.
Thank you so much, Joel. And on behalf of the Bush Institute and SMU, we are really delighted to be part of this project and more generally to be working with Joel and Urban Reform Institute, Ann, and this whole team on this important body of work. Been working closely with Joel for 5 years now, and we're really proud of all that we've worked on together. So great. Thank you so much for all of you all for participating. I wish we could welcome you to Texas as we had once discussed, but next year. So the basic point of this report that we want to convey is this. From the Franklin Roosevelt administration to the Bush 43 administration, America made really a top level policy priority of promoting homeownership as a key step on the ladder of upward mobility for the American people. Now, in the years since the 2008 housing crash, we've kind of lost the thread on that. And I would argue we've lost the thread on something bigger, which is the whole narrative of a set of policy priorities around promoting opportunity above all for the next generation and widening the horizon of opportunity for the American people. So that's fundamentally what we're trying to get across. We're trying to put opportunity back center stage in the middle of the policy agenda for this country. So Joel, I want to make just 4 specific points. Just obviously everyone can read the report, but these are kind of very, very high level overviews. First basic point, and that is that the connection between home ownership and opportunity is really tight, much more than people oftentimes realize. Home ownership is critical to financial stability for a great many families. It's a hedge against rising housing prices. It has been the backbone of wealth accumulation for the American middle class, partly because it's a very efficient means of forced savings over time, partly because home prices have tended to trend upwards in most places most of the time. But beyond this, home ownership has changed, it tends to change people's behavior. We know that if you take 2 families at the same income level, homeowners typically actually accumulate more non-housing assets than renters, suggesting that they're in effect saving more and taking a longer term view of the future. They also volunteer more, engage more in their communities, do more for their kids' school. In all kinds of ways, they engage in activities that are good for the next generation. Neighborhoods that have high home ownership rates tend to have lower crime. They tend to have higher achievement rates for kids in school. And this is very material to what happens for the next generation. We cite a lot of data in the report, but one simple point, a University of Pittsburgh study found that the difference between a family having a very moderate but positive amount of net wealth and 0, which by the way characterizes roughly 40% of American households, makes a tremendous, highly significant difference in whether the kids go to any kind of college or not. So that's point number 1. It's important. Number 2, we're not doing very well. The data that we've presented in the report shows that we essentially managed to increase home ownership rates continuously from the 1930s with minor breaks until 2004. Since that time, we actually went significantly backwards from 69% roughly to about 63% of American households. We managed to bounce a little bit back to 65% during the last 3 or 4 years prior to COVID. But the fact that we're 4% below the old high really understates the problem, because the American people have been growing older. Older families have tended to stay in their homes longer. When you laser focus on what's happening with millennials, but also when you focus on what's happening with historically disadvantaged populations, for example, Black and Hispanic families, the rates of decline since the old high have been much, much greater, as we document in the report. Why are we doing so badly? I can tell you, we can absolutely assure you, it's not because any of these populations don't value homeownership or opportunity as much as before. Surveys show they're indistinguishable from older generations in what they aspire to in life, in terms of the big picture that we're talking about today. The fact is that housing's become unaffordable for a great many Americans in a great many of our metropolitan areas, particularly the ones where people increasingly want to be. That is a result, as we argue in the report, of deep dysfunctions in public policy, federal, state, and local, and we call for fixing those in this report. Third point, and that is that America really can do better. We should be optimistic about this. There was a narrative that developed after the crash of 2008 that, well, we kind of tried homeownership and we just can't push it past a certain rate. It just doesn't work. That's what the crisis arguably showed. We show in the report that is total nonsense. What we showed in the crash of 2008 was that you can't build higher home ownership on a totally toxic, financially unsustainable system of housing finance. But actually, home ownership peaked in 2004 and trended downwards over the next 4 years because of the speculative boom in housing prices in that era. Home ownership didn't cause the crash. Bad policy and bad financial structures did. On the contrary, what we actually can say is we can point to our own history. Home ownership rates were higher in the 1970s than they are today in America. We can also look abroad, where we can see, for example, that all but 6 European countries have higher home ownership rates than the US. A recent study of 44 advanced countries found that the average home ownership rate was roughly 74%, fully 9 percentage points higher than the United States. Surely we can do better. And the last point, fourth point we do in this report is to really outline in broad terms a policy agenda. Please, I advise you to look at the report, but very simply, first policy point is we need a whole lot more housing supply all up and down the spectrum, all kind of product types. That calls for a radical change in the policy agenda. Wendell's going to talk about that in a little while. Secondly, we also argue that we need modern, we need a real rethink of the whole housing finance system to adapt to modern realities. For example, student debt wasn't a big deal back in the 1960s and 70s. Now we really need a system in which young people can roll student debt into a mortgage. We need new approaches to try to hold down payments, such as community land trusts and shared appreciation mortgages, and a whole raft of possible innovations that are being tried out there. We need to get more serious at the national level of implementing those things. And the last point, and this really will hopefully segue into what Anne will talk about, is we need to actually adopt a whole opportunity agenda. We need to put the idea of creating opportunities for the next generation more front and center in our whole policy program. That means better paths from education to the workforce, fewer obstacles to opportunity, a whole raft of things that we talk about in the report, and that is the core of everything that we work on at the Bush Institute and the core of a whole lot of what Urban Reform Institute does as well. So we're proud of this report. And Joel, I think I'll leave it there and let Anne take over.
Thanks, Colum. I can't wish I could see all of you. I can't, but good to see all of you. I've really enjoyed working on this report. It has felt like an undermentioned part of our broader national heat and ideological debates the last couple of years, this notion of transfer of opportunity and where is that happening and where isn't. And home ownership, as this report sort of hones in on as the protagonist, is a key piece of that. I don't think it's the only piece. We're not claiming that it is. But I just think that framework of how we're thinking about transgenerational transfers of opportunity is a very interesting way to think about sort of the ongoing American project. So I'm going to depress you a little further, and then hopefully that will lay the groundwork to have a back and forth amongst the panelists and the audience on where to from here vis-a-vis millennials and young people. But you're going to have to go into the dark with me for a second. So millennials aren't doing terrific. There's, of course, they're often the canary in the coal mine for a lot of the broader societal dysfunction, societal pain points. There's the ongoing invisible issues pre-pandemic and certainly accelerated and accentuated by the pandemic, namely just a lot of distrust, greater loneliness, more anxiety, higher levels of mental health challenges, not a lot of pride per se, always in the country, sort of contesting what the country is morally. But then there's just more, some of this is attributed to just very tangible material causes of concern. And of very real causes for a generational shrug of the shoulders towards the future, if not outright fear. And one of these is the sense that economic mobility has genuinely slowed, and the data backs this up. Only about 1 in 3 parents anticipate the next generation, like parents of millennials today, so most largely boomers, anticipate the next generation being better off than their own. 90% of those born in 1940 ended up earning more than their parents, but only 50 to 60% of those born in 1980 have ended up with a higher income than their parents. So there's just a general flattening. Some studies project that millennials will hold only 16% of the nation's wealth in 2030, so 10 years from now, even though by that point they will be the largest adult generation by far. Gen Xers, the preceding generation, will hold 31%, while boomers entering their 80s and 90s will still control 45% of the nation's wealth. So those are decently sobering stats in terms of fluidity. I think one way we sort of articulated this in the report is that achieving the American dream for the next generation just increasingly feels like entitlement for the privileged. And we could have a debate about meritocracy here, but rather than just a reasonable aspiration for a wide swath of people. And one major factor we think that's sort of squeezing young people's fortunes is this upward spiral in housing costs. Homeownership rates for millennials are quite a bit lower, 24% lower than the levels attained by the previous 3 generations at the same age. There just is a widespread sense that you can't actually arrive, or to borrow the hashtag adult, you can't adult until way later than was previously true. And there's some cultural reasons for this, social script shifting, people getting married later, but there's also financial piece. And somewhat interestingly, I think compared to boomers, you talk to many millennials, and there's some data backing this up. Home ownership is actually seen as more of a capstone to independent adulthood than marriage is. It's like considered quasi equal to having your first child, which may be a reflection of how hard it has become. I think you hear you've heard probably a lot of us the last number of years, heard boomers and others sort of dismiss millennials as like failing to launch, as if it's sort of a challenge of willpower or even character. And of course, each generation has its own moral challenges in developing into full human beings. But I think what's driving millennials' behavior for the most part is less cultural preferences and more economics. Millennials switch jobs, contrary to stereotypes, way less than prior generations at the same age. They spend less on luxuries. They express like nearly the same long-term goals as previous generations. Some 89% of today's young people want to own a home. But since in the last 20 years, since 2000, the number of Americans between ages 18 and 34 living with their parents has just exploded, from 17 million to over 22 million. And the main obstacle to owning a home and getting there is just they can't afford it. Another immediate problem is just the growing share of millennials' paychecks being devoted to necessities, from student debt payments and rent to utilities, transportation, and mobile phone bills. Incomes are not keeping up, particularly in big cities with soaring rental rates. So consequently, millennials have very little savings. 52% of them don't own a retirement account. And studies show that almost 2/3 of millennials report that they're just living paycheck to paycheck. And then there's just this issue of even more, you could call it inequality, just like radically diverging destinies. And a lot of this is education based. Do you have a college education or do you not? On measures of health and life expectancy and economic prospects, those with a college degree or more are doing better than comparable college educated young adults in the past. But today, their peers with only a high school diploma or less are just doing way worse than their historical counterparts. And more than 1/3 of millennials fall into just the high school educated or less. COVID, I just want to cover that really quickly. 2020. Obviously, young people have not been quite as affected from a lethal standpoint than older generations by the pandemic, but the economic fallout has been acute. Before COVID, the average millennial was doing pretty well in terms of earnings, in line with what you'd expect on the experience of past generations and sort of long-term growth of the economy. But there's just been a huge increase in month-to-month uncertainty around income, which is partly a result of just the rise of gig economy and freelance one-offs, which has helped fuel this pervasive sense of rootlessness and financial insecurity amongst millennials. A staggering over half of people under the age of 45 have lost a job this year. That's a huge number, been put on leave or had their hours reduced due to the pandemic, compared with just a quarter of folks over the age of 45. There's more I could say, and we can get into it, so I'll wrap up here. There's more negatives I could say coming out of the pandemic, but one, I think, positive thing I've noticed both in interviews as well as a lot of peers is a whole new set. There's sort of the pandemic, the social distancing, ongoing sense of like home is where all of life suddenly is. There have been many relocations, and I think people are making decisions, mobility decisions of where they want to live, not only if they have a job, not just based on a job, because for some that's become the sort of physical coordinates of where you work has become irrelevant to other criteria, better community, cheaper cost of living, other cultural things perhaps. And I think there's an opportunity to rethink for policymakers, for people in the sort of real estate development world, has, I think, made many young Americans much more aware of sort of the virtues of dispersion and figuring out a way to pair their home, personal, community, work life, vocational kind of civic life in different ways that aren't just sort of where you have two options of moving to DC or New York or San Francisco, and then the rest is sort of Class B. There's just a much greater awareness, I think, of the wealth of diverse options in the country at large, which I personally view as a positive, and it'll be interesting to see how the world of real estate and sort of housing policy responds.
Actually, it's really nice that you were able to answer these questions, because actually you answered one of the questions that already came in. So somehow you've you have the zeitgeist somehow. I'd like to turn this over to Pete Saunders. Pete has worked with us on other projects. He has a terrific blog called Cornerside Yard. He writes for Urbanophile. He writes for Russwire, writes for Bloomberg. Pete, how does this crisis, one of the things we see is obviously that there's been lots of problems for millennials, which we dealt with, but how is this, how do you see this in Chicago, and how do you see this affecting minority communities?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. It really does affect minority communities. If you look at the report and my contribution to it, it's sort of a dispatch from the Rust Belt. And I think that when you look at this part of the country, Chicago and the broader Rust Belt, I think you'll see this being the place where that opportunity was first designated or identified as one of the places where home ownership could be a linchpin in terms of the growth of the region. I kind of related a personal story of home ownership and how it worked in my family that kind of brought our family into the middle class with the purchase of a home by my grandparents and then my parents, and how that's transferred throughout down to myself. So I think it's been great, but the one thing that I have to caution that is that the lack of growth, I think, that's occurred in the Rust Belt in much of the Midwest over the last 30 to 40 years or so has sort of hastened the decline, the growth in mobility. There are fewer opportunities, even though there's more home ownership because there are lower values and more affordable places here, but there's less mobility because there's not been the growth to kickstart everything else or catalyze everything else. So we have higher levels of home ownership in much of the Midwest, but we don't always have that becoming something that generates intergenerational transfer of wealth later on. So that's one of the things that we need to be sort of cautious of and cognizant of.
And that's great. Well, there's a perfect follow-on to Carla. Carla's worked with us on numerous projects, and probably more than any of us has been in the trenches working with working class couples and families here in Southern California, which is, anyone knows, real estate knows, this is a very, very hard market for everyone who isn't really wealthy or had the advantage of buying their first house in 1980, like me. So Carla, what are you seeing out in, and you're out in the Inland Empire, which is the one part of California that's still growing. How do you see these challenges affecting the emerging here in California? Obviously the plurality of Latinos, but also the millennial generation and people living in places like Riverside, San Bernardino.
And besides growing, it's one of the purple areas that we have in the state. So, there are Republicans in California, and many of them live here in Inland Empire. So I think that also goes to tell that this is not a political problem. This is a community problem. We really are having a crisis. In California, for Latinos, well, in general, for anyone in the nation, there's not one state in the nation where you can afford to live in a 2-bedroom apartment with a 1 salary of minimum wage. There's just no way. So in California, that's exacerbated. And we, in the Inland Empire, we are not in the coast, so our prices are more affordable, but there are no jobs. So I really wanted to echo what Pete was saying, that it's a combination, that home is, more than a house. Home is a community, and you have to think about it in that way. And when you buy a home, you're thinking about the grocery store, the access to transportation, the access to jobs, and it's not isolated. One of the things that I wanted to point out that I did not include in my essay is there's a huge detriment between the communication between civil society and the planning departments and the policymakers. When you attend the meetings at the local level, where housing is really determined, not at the national level, but at the state and local level. And the localities really have a huge impact. So I can tell you that Latinos are not very involved in politics, and that and not involved in civic participation in general. It's even difficult to count them for census and get them to vote. So it's even more difficult to get them to be part of planning inclusive communities that give them opportunities that are appropriate for them. Latinos in California face huge challenges. They are some of the least paid workers. They are essential workers at this time who are living in overcrowded conditions. Many times, even single family homes have 2 or 3 families living in the same home. And it's in COVID-19, that is a terrible situation to find yourself in when you need space, when you need, when you need space basically to survive. So one of the things I wanted to point out about the report is that it really is talking about the opportunity for everybody based on how can we provide for each locality at a local level. How can we get Latinos and minorities and millennials and everybody that's being affected by this together to talk about the issues and the local policies. From the report, I don't want to go off too much of the report. I did want to point out some of the good things that are happening. There is a rebound of homeownership in Latinos, but it has to be tied also to income. So if you don't have the income to afford a home, you will not be able to afford a home. But what we are, even though I want to say that there is a rebound, there is a bigger problem that I would like to address, which is the mismanagement of the current housing stock that we have. The crisis that's coming with the evictions and the foreclosures that are looming because of the pandemic's economic recession that will come, there's nowhere to go. And a lot of these homeowners that will lose their homes, those homes will be bought by investors who will then turn these homes into rentals. We are having a crisis of not having enough stock to be bought by anybody because they're turning into perpetual money makers rather than investments in people. And people do not retire on income, they retire on investment. And we are not giving people the opportunity to retire on any of these opportunities of transfer of homeownership. Small businesses are hurting. Homeownership is hurting. And I can't think of any other wealth building tool that working families can have at hand. To have access to a 401k, that is very difficult. Especially when you are a essential worker, that's a luxury and that's not even available. And then playing in the stocks, you have to have really big cash to be in there. So really homeownership and small businesses are still the backbone of democracy, I think, because it really gives people the ability to thrive. And if Latinos thrive and all minorities thrive, if we all thrive, our country will be a better place. And I hope that is what we take away from here, that we need to work together on this because it affects everybody. If we were in person and I asked everybody to raise their hand, if they themselves are having trouble or paying too much for their home or know somebody that's paying too much of their home here in California, I bet you everybody would raise their hand because there's nobody that can afford to live here. Latinos are leaving California. They are moving to the heartland. That's one of the next projects that we're working with Joel. A lot of these moves are based on economics, but once they get to the heartland, they have no integration into society. And that's another problem. They need to be participants of democracy because a lot of the statistics that I can give you will not change if we do not create the communication channels between the minorities and the millennials and all of the people that are not participating civically and the people who are creating these homes and the people who are financing these homes. So it's a collaborative effort that is very complex, but it's very worth the fight and the conversation.
Thank you, Cola. What we're going to do now, we have a few minutes for questions. We've been getting some great questions. And I'll open this up to anyone. How do we develop a nonpartisan approach? John Clarkson asked, how do we depoliticize housing so that there's more opportunity? What are the policy levers that conceivably in this divided country be used and be implemented. I'm open to anybody. Colin?
Okay, no one else is going to take it. Did you say Colin or Carla? I think you said Colin.
I think Colin.
Darn. Okay. Carla had the answer. You know, it's interesting. The on the policies that I think I personally would regard as the most important, some of which feature prominently in our report. You know, this is a rare case where the most powerful dividing lines aren't actually between red and blue. I actually think there's more possible area for a kind of a really constructive, opportunity-oriented sort of middle ground set of solutions here than in most other policy domains. So, you know, I think where we really kind of see the big dividing lines, you could say, is between, for lack of a better word, a policy program that would be growth-oriented and would actually try to create more housing supply in high-opportunity places where there is demand, and those who resist it. And those who resist it span the political spectrum. I think what we have seen, you know, at the Bush Institute, I think, Joel, as you know, we've put together a lot of data across metro areas of the United States, and we actually see a gigantic difference in the policy programs, just how growth-oriented or how restrictive they are. And one thing we see again and again, I think this goes to kind of what Wendell's going to talk about, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but it goes to the idea that typically when there has been large growth in supply, it has had a strong tendency to be in, you know, in lower density suburban areas. That's kind of not that surprising in a lot of respects. You know, and I think that in those places, there are parts that really are politically controversial, like how much to accept, for example, subsidized, affordable multifamily housing. And then there are areas that aren't very controversial, like building new single family homes in undeveloped areas. So we could do a heck of a lot better with the uncontroversial part. That would be the low hanging fruit, I would argue. And then, you know, kind of think about the really controversial stuff, you know, as a second tier issue.
Okay, I think I can contribute something to that. I think we need to shift radically the way that we think about the way we design housing and really leverage technology, as Anne was talking about, how location has become somewhat irrelevant, but it doesn't, not for everybody. And like I said, yes, you can build homes in the suburb, in the exurbs, like where I live, but if you have an hour-and-a-half commute to work every day, you have a 45% chance of getting divorced. That's it. You need to be with your family. You need to be with your community. So this notion that you can just cram all of these jobs and then stack people up in all of these high rises, I'm sorry to say that it's not healthy. And I come from Mexico City. I'm an immigrant myself. I came here when I was 15, brought here when I was 15 years old. So I have lived in a very busy city. If you have ever been to Mexico City, it's a very, very crowded city. And it's beautiful in its own kind, but it is not a healthy city to live in. You're stressed. You are, right now they're having a really hard time with keeping space between people and their COVID. So we can reimagine policy using and leveraging technology. I work from home. This is the home that I talked about in my essay. I am here working from my house. I am lucky, I am privileged, so I am not saying this is a solution for everybody, but it is a solution for some of us. And it may be able to create other opportunities. For example, now I spend more money here in my community eating at local restaurants than if I was commuting somewhere else. I'm closer to my kids. My kids come from home and we say hello around 2 or 3 when the pandemic was not around. Now they're here all the time. I may find the vaccine myself. So we are here having this different life, but it's not a bad idea that we are here together. Maybe I need an office outside of where I live. Maybe I do need to go to one of those co-working spaces to have a meeting or to have peace of mind, or maybe my house is designed in a different way in the future where I can have a space to work. But there is an ability for us to reimagine and not get stuck in the past that a lot of things were bad. Okay, let's take what we have and let's build on that.
You know, if I may, just one quick point that I'd like to make. I kind of want to jump on a point that Carla made a little earlier about the number of investors who are moving into certain communities and how that has had an impact on the inventory of available housing to actually build to move into home ownership. And that is something that I've seen as a big problem here. One of the things that's happened since the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis is that prior to that, we saw the proliferation of the mortgages that were directed towards minorities of all types that were problematic, and that led to the foreclosure crisis that we had. Well, I think we need to. I think what we've seen is the pendulum swung severely in the other way, where lending controls were tightened, and then people who had wanted to get a home were less able to do so. So I think we need to be able to find ways to be able to have that loosened up again, and find new opportunities for people to come into to get those mortgages and to go into home ownership. Again, like I said, I think that one of the big issues has been the investors moving into areas and taking those homes off of the inventory, and we need to deal with that.
Exacerbated by the fact that the affordability is just not there. I mean, I don't know, in Chicago, you say in certain areas it's affordable to build, but not really a good investment in the future because there's not a lot of economic development. But are there areas in Chicago where you can build affordably and have a family buy a home affordably with a median income, Pete?
Yes, I would say you're looking at the far exurban areas where that's able to happen right now. If you look at the areas that look like the background that I have right here, which is in the middle of Chicago, downtown, it's highly unaffordable. But there are affordable areas that are scattered throughout the region. We're a little different, I think, than most other metropolitan areas, and that carries over to much of the Rust Belt as well. So where there is some affordability, but a lot of the issues that we have are more related to overall growth in the region than it is to specifically housing issues.
Okay, look, we have another panel. This has been great. I want to thank all of you. Please hang around because there may be questions that you may be best suited to answer. But let's go to our second panel, which is a little bit more into the guts of the issue. When we get into the issue of home ownership and prices and regulation, I think Wendell Cox is the expert in the whole country. We're very fortunate that he's associated with what we're doing. Wendell, what is the role of policy in all this? And then we have three guys who actually have to build this stuff, and they can sort of maybe give us some sort of reality check as well. Wendell, you got to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
right.
hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to make Fiverr host it. I need the screen sharing. Can somebody provide that? I was told I was going to be able to do the PowerPoint. Charles, are you there?
I am. I'll just do the PowerPoint for you. I thought you'd be able to do it, but I'll screen share for you.
Okay. Well, yeah. Go ahead. Start out. We'll go through quickly here. Like Cullum, I'm going to make 5 or 6 points. So go ahead. You've got the PowerPoint there, I think.
Yep.
Okay.
We're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Put the slideshow up. See, up above. There we are.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. That's the title. We don't need that. Let's go on right into this thing. The OECD, which is an international financial organization, has basically suggested that the middle class around the first world is highly threatened, and we certainly know that that's the case in the United States. And in addition to that, they point out that the principal cause is the rise in housing costs that have been going up much more than incomes. And by the way, that's not rents. That's housing costs. That's the cost of owned housing. We've been working on international housing affordability for some years now and have developed a rating system that's been adopted all over the place, basically looking at what houses cost versus incomes, because you cannot talk about housing affordability without talking about the relationship to incomes. You can see that 3 times incomes, annual incomes, is affordable. Over 5 is severely unaffordable, and I'm going to talk about that. Next slide, please. Okay, this basically shows you how housing affordability has changed in the last 70 years. You can see that in 1970, California looked like the rest of the country, but since that time, it's gone through the roof. In fact, now all of the 12 housing markets in our annual report in the United States and all of the 30 markets in the world that have severely unaffordable housing have what's called urban containment policy. Now, urban containment policy, let me also point out, about 85% of the difference of the United States between the cost of living in the higher cost area and the average is due to housing cost differential. So it really is there. And there are huge differences around the country. You can see some of our metropolitan areas are very unaffordable. Believe it or not, a lot of the country is still affordable. You go not only to the Midwest and the Rust Belt, but you go to the South, you're going to find far more affordable prices. Next slide, please. Here is a description of how urban land markets work. You can see, and this is dealing with the issue of urban containment, which is really the big problem in housing affordability. Urban containment is when you basically go drawing a ring around a city and like a metropolitan area, and basically saying there shall be no development on the outside, or there'll be very restricted development on the outside. The problem, and that's what this graph shows, is that when you impose, say, an urban growth boundary, which is the most popular strategy of urban containment, you drive up the price of land costs within the area, and they fall to the outside. And not only do you drive the costs up, but you drive the costs up throughout the entire area. So the cost differential that arises at the urban fringe flows through to the rest of the city. Research in Australia, New Zealand, and Portland basically says that urban containment policy increases the cost of land between 8 and 20 times. Next time. And by the way, go ahead to the next. Urban containment really is the planning orthodoxy internationally. You'll go to Australia, New Zealand, much of Canada, and about a third of the United States. It's all urban containment policy. Where housing is affordable is where we don't have urban containment policy. Now, this slide summarizes stuff out of Glaser and Diorco in a 2018 study. What they basically found looking at the median house in the San Francisco metropolitan area, and I'm not talking about the city of San Francisco, I'm talking about the 5 counties, San Mateo, Alameda, Contra Costa, San Francisco, and Marin. In the median house in those areas, they found, and there's a mistake on this slide, I had changed it on my version. Right now, I should say in 2015, they found generally that land costs were approximately $450,000 more than they would be in a healthily regulated market. Now, so when I see, for example, that something has raised the cost of housing in San Francisco by $50,000, I laugh. Because in fact, urban containment has increased the cost of housing throughout the places where it's been implemented. Yes, almost 500,000 in the Bay Area, 100, 200,000 easily in Portland and Seattle and Miami, places like that. Next slide, please. The basic problem is that with urban containment policy, costs of land are so much that we cannot afford to profitably build housing for middle income people. Now, what are the consequences? Well, one, we really lower the standard of living. I mean, as Carla has indicated, it's not just that somebody living on one income can't afford a house anywhere in California. If you look at the qualifying income required to buy the median house in coastal California, Orange County, San Diego, LA, San Jose, San Francisco, in each of those metropolitan areas, you need an income that is either in the top 20% or almost the top 20%. Middle-class people cannot afford middle-class housing. Greater poverty. In California, 2 million more people are in poverty because of housing prices than they would be if the costs were the same as in the rest of the country. more inequality, more people needing housing assistance. We have been undersupplying affordable low-income housing for decades, and it's only going to get worse. And by the way, I would suggest very quickly responding to something that Pete and Carla talked about. You want to know why Wall Street is buying up houses? Well, it's real simple. Because of the supply limitations in California and places like that, housing costs, housing prices are going up much more than other investments, and you can expect it. And until we get regulation under control, we can expect this to go further and get longer, and we're going to see more house cost increases. The other thing is that there's considerable research in recent years indicating significant losses in economic growth as a result of excessive land use regulation. And the final slide, please. Okay, so the solution is to put people first. The role of urban planning is not to build cities, it's to provide an environment that people can afford to live in. Alan Berteau, who used to be a principal planner with the World Bank, basically says the purpose of urban planning should be to ensure housing affordability and to provide mobility throughout the metropolitan area. So what should we do? Urban containment should be avoided wherever it has not already been implemented. If you do not do that, you will see house prices go up significantly. Toronto, for example, has seen the prices of houses go up more than 2 times since their adding of urban containment only 15 years ago. Where urban containment does exist, it needs to be relaxed. And in another report, we've made recommendations for regulatory relief that needs to be put in California so that not only people and people and companies who would like to stay in California can at least stay in some place that's still relatively affordable, like Fresno or Sacramento or the Inland Empire. And by the way, in all of those places, housing affordability at this point is almost as bad as Seattle, which is pretty bad. Finally, I think the bottom line is that we should recognize what is the purpose of planning. The purpose of planning is not city building. It is not pretty towns. It is improving the lives of people. And that is essentially what Jane Jacobs said in her final interview. And I think it's good advice for all of us, including the entire planning and policy community. Thank you very much.
What I'd like to do is now we're going to get reactions from 3 people who actually are in the trenches and are trying to provide this kind of housing. Joel Farkas, you've been a developer for over 30 years, mostly in the Denver area. What steps could we possibly take, and maybe that you're taking in your business, to create attainable housing for the next generation?
What we can do is something we're doing right now. The data that we have discussed is correct. It's daunting, it's frightening. However, the easiest thing to do is to go and look at what the middle-class Americans are already doing. They are packing up and leaving, which means they're leaving an apartment they're renting in a city that they're paying $3,000 to $5,000 a month rent, moving 30 minutes or more away, saving $2,000 a month. They've made an active choice. They put a down payment. They bought a home. And this is what is going on in the United States by the millions right now. And what happens when we try to, my point is, trying to change elected officials and policy is a daunting task. Elected officials have their own agenda, and the top item on their agenda is not to put families in homes. I mean, we can see, in the early 1950s, the 8 European Union countries, the leaders combined had 32 children. Today, within the last year or two, all the leaders of those countries had 3 children. It's not the top priority of many people who are elected officials in this world. And so, but it is the top priority of middle-class Americans, and in particular, African Americans, Latinos, all kinds of people, all kinds of different diverse groups of people. A family, a safe, secure environment, a reasonably priced environment is exactly what is being purchased today. So our job as a developer is not to change the perspective of our buyers in our community. It is to provide what they already tell us they want.
Mark, does this make any sense to you, given your experience? Mark is with True Homes and Charlotte. We have people from 3 different regions, so we wanted to get the perspectives. That what Joel says, does that make sense to what you're seeing in Charlotte?
Sure, yes. This migration pattern within existing metropolitan areas, moving out to the suburban and exurban areas for affordability has certainly been a trend. I would believe, my entire career, we are observing that it's accelerating in this COVID period. Also, we're seeing the acceleration of migration among cities and regions. So we're seeing the upper Midwest, the Northeast, California, the migration out of those areas into land of opportunity, like we're in here in the Carolinas, which are a high quality of life. We're seeing that, what I would call the COVID migration. When we look back in history to the period we're in, I think we're going to see a dramatic migration as people become more footloose, put more value on quality of life, and certainly cost of living is absolutely tied to quality of life. So they're moving from high housing cost, high taxation locations into lower taxation, moderate housing cost locations. And that's why we're seeing such demand here in the Carolinas. And that's across generations. We're seeing retirees moving for that, for those reasons. And we're seeing young people just out of college moving for those exact same reasons.
Some people say, well, this building on the periphery is bad for the environment. Any answer to that?
Complete nonsense.
And why?
The number one, using the Denver metropolitan area as an example, the number one highest cost that you will pay for a house is the raw water tap. It will be as much as $50,000 or more just for the water resource. Why is it so expensive? And same thing in California, because people historically in these urban containment areas have lived where it's sunny and dry. It doesn't rain or snow there, which means the water has to move. So if you are going to do everything you can to ruin the environment, what you would do is you would take water from hundreds, if not more, thousands of miles away and move it somewhere. If you live where the water is, right off the bat, the single greatest thing you can do for environmental stewardship is to live where your water resources are. And we're seeing that in the thousands of municipalities in the country that historically people in these urban containment areas in these sunny places said, who would ever live there? Well, you would live there because it's really a fine place to live. But there's so much that goes into developing. I don't know why anyone, and the typical answer for that question of people who oppose this is, when you're in a condensed consolidated area, transportation is more efficient. I don't know of one large city in the world where anyone would say health, safety, welfare, and transportation is more efficient and more effective.
Mark, you have anything to add there?
Sure. Well, in the Carolinas, we're converting farmland that's not very productive and monoculture pine forests into neighborhoods. And so we're adding diversity, we're adding stormwater quality. And so really, I think when you look at the environmental impact of our neighborhoods post-development, is a better environment from a nature standpoint than prior to development. Even speaking for Ted, and we're active in one of his developments in Charleston. Again, they're converting a single monoculture pine forest. There's a tremendous amount of open space, and they're working to convert that monoculture into a diverse forest with literally a 50 to 100-year perspective on what that will look like in the future. So I would say that today's development standards, our approach to development, absolutely has an eye towards environmental and sustainability.
New York City New York City, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, LA, and go through every single major city in America is not more environmentally sensitive and efficient than any place we build.
Wendell, anything on some of the research you've looked at in Australia?
Well, all I would say, all I would urge is, we need to be focusing on people. How can it be that Fremont, California needs $190,000 impact fee per dwelling unit, per house, when there are all sorts of communities around this country that don't require 1/5 or 1/10 of that? So again, the point is we need to be focusing on people. All of these policies, especially urban containment, which is by far the most destructive, all of these policies have been largely agreed upon without consideration of the affordability impacts and the impacts on the cost of living. And by the way, what we do when we force prices up by $50,000 tap fees in Metro Denver and so on, we increase the number of people that need subsidies, and we increase the demand for subsidized housing. Everybody wants to increase affordable housing. Best way you can increase affordable housing is to get the cost of market rate housing under control.
The other big issue then is, besides the environmental one, is transportation. Here in California, we have something called vehicle miles traveled policy. Basically, the idea being that if you are in the suburbs, then you're going to have a longer commute. Has the online shift, both on the environmental side and on the traffic side, strengthened the argument of the kind of communities that you're building?
Absolutely, unequivocally, unassailably, yes. The technology in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area has basically asserted that technology allows people to do anything, anywhere, anytime. By that definition, you do not need to be in a contained urban environment. You can be anywhere and do anything at any time. So therefore, you don't have to, the modeling of transportation and vehicle miles driven, because of our pandemic, as well as new technological advances, has completely thrown those historic models on their head.
I would agree with that. We're seeing all sorts of new patterns of working. And I think COVID has accelerated the work from home. So the post-COVID period, I think, again, will be a new model of what transportation looks like on a community and a household level. And but again, I think as it relates to policies and prescriptions, we'll be guided by old models and old mindsets, which are codified in our regulatory regime. And so again, I think this idea that we need to be flexible. For example, in Charlotte, just last month, there was a affordable apartment development approved with 0 parking, none. So that would be a fresh new perspective that's looking at current conditions to inform regulatory policy. So I would hope that we would see those types of innovations coming more often.
What sort of policy agenda? I mean, really our struggle is there seems to have been this religion of the planning community. And how do we, as a community, you as developers, us as a think tank, how do we get this message out, and what are the solid proposals that we could actually make, so maybe we could move this a little bit more in a rational direction? Wendell, anything you suggest?
Well, just very quickly, first of all, I have very little hope for policy. I have very little hope that we can change the minds of planners. They've been saying the same things around the world now for more than 70 years, okay? It may have taken us 30 or 40 to jump on the bandwagon in a few places in this country, but they're not going to change. The point is, now with COVID, things have been really changed. The dynamic has radically changed. And as a colleague, a planner who is not, of the planning orthodoxy, told me yesterday, people are going to make the decisions this time. And the planning has largely become irrelevant. People are making their decisions. You scare people into moving away from density. They're going to move away from density. I don't care how many econometric studies you do to try to pretend that density doesn't make a difference.
Joel?
I cannot agree more than what I just heard. The father of the UCLA Urban Planning Department, who just passed away, did his entire life's work describing how urban development, in particular China and other places around the world, was the exact future. Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize on economic geography modeling. And he basically said, the only relevant place to live in the world is in an urban area in any country, and they will deal with each other all over the world. And everywhere else in the rural, exurban, and suburban areas are irrelevant. So I agree. I don't believe we will ever change that orthodoxy. But one of the things to answer what we can do, another thing that Wendell said, in our community that we're building in Colorado, our entire set of impact fees is less than $50,000 total for everything per home, where the competitive environments could be $100,000 to $150,000. One of the single largest costs to providing an attainable, reasonably priced home that is least looked at it's not the land, it's not the house, it's not the marketing, it's not the sales, it's the impact fees. So the answer is build in a place in a way where you can dramatically reduce those fees, which means you will take control of water treatment, water distribution, wastewater treatment, wastewater distribution, storm drainage, and everything else.
I want to now be able to go turn to Ted. You're connected with us now, right?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Given what
Okay.
Joel's talking about, it seems to me Houston has developed a model with municipal utility districts that maybe answer some of these questions. Is it getting any harder to develop in the Houston area? Or is this a model that can be exported?
If you're in the Houston city limits or the Houston ETJ, it's probably marginally harder. But if you have your own municipal utility district, which has to be approved by the city, but they're approved routinely, you control your own destiny. You build your own water plant. You build your own sewer plant to full standards. We're not talking about substandard stuff here. And if I could offer a couple of thoughts on more of the global issues here, and I like Joel's comments about Paul Krugman, and what we need is both and. We need urban and we need suburban. I mean, that's the only way we win on a go-forward basis. And we need rental and we need for sale. We don't need one or the other. We need a combination of both. And the clear commercial trend over the last 50 years has been decentralization of cities. I don't know how ULI and others can just continue to ignore this. It's crazy. And that we also waste billions and billions of dollars on transit that won't work simply because the residential density will never support transit. But the regulatory burden is what's killing housing in whichever form you want it. And it seems like the smaller the city almost, the worse it gets.
What I'm wondering, this is for all the panelists, is there any way to make an alliance with, let's say, middle working class people who may not have any idea that this is affecting them? I mean, it seems to me that part of the problem is also the media. And Ted, I'm thinking of your local newspaper, the Houston Chronicle. I mean, it's almost as if it's being written from Greenwich Village.
She's a
excuse
zealot.
me?
She is a zealot that happened to win a Pulitzer Prize and thinks she knows more than anybody and everybody. So that's a problem that we bear.
So the question is really going to be, and as we try to do these things, is how do we get these messages out to a broader public, particularly because it seems to me that all three of you are unusual in that we find that most developers aren't willing to take on these issues. I can't tell you how often Wendell and I may make a presentation and the developers will come up to us and say, well, we know you're right, but we can't say anything in public about it. How do we turn this around? Any suggestions?
The biggest issue that we all three face is time. And government officials now know, and they understand that if they can tie us up, nothing happens because it becomes uneconomic. The sad thing is that these local officials are those middle-class people that you just talked about that are not in my backyard. It is extremely disappointing to go before a city council or a P&Z and ask the simple question, you don't want your grandchild, you don't want your child to be able to live in your city? Because that's what you're telling me. And they laugh at you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know. I'm sure all of us have been to combined more than several thousand city council meetings and homeowner association meetings and county commissioner meetings. I don't recall ever being to any of those where someone stood up opposing our project who said, I want someone who makes less, whose house costs less, living next to me. I've never actually heard those words. So this notion that the policymakers and elected officials have some affinity for affordable housing is just an empty, vacuous promise. They don't.
Let me just suggest one proposal we saw in California, Senate bill, which would have allowed you to subdivide your lot and put, in essence, an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, which would double the suburban density overnight, which would empower every homeowner to say yes in my backyard, would have zero requirement for additional infrastructure to be built. I'm a big fan of that idea. Charlotte, a number of years ago, 2012, permitted accessory dwelling units in all single-family residential classifications, and we're working hard to figure out ways to build those and to unlock that potential that, in essence, exists in everyone's backyard. But that would be a liberalization, probably too libertarian for the progressive class. But that would be a tremendous liberalization of land use in our cities and would empower the homeowners to unlock the value of their backyard and would test this theory that everyone is a NIMBY, would put that decision in their own hands of whether they're going to say yes in my backyard or no.
I'm thinking about this. I have some mixed feelings about it as somebody who has a house. I don't know how much and of course in California now they're talking about as many as 4 units in a backyard. So the danger, of course, is that if you're a homeowner and then you say, okay, we'll do this. Like in my town, you can build an accessory unit, particularly for family members. Once you open that up, the very character of your community is in some trouble. But let me just ask last great opportunity, which is we're going to have a lot of redundant office and retail in our cities and in our suburbs as well. Is there any opportunity there to solve the housing problem in part by changing usage? Any of you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I believe that already we're seeing redundancy in excess parking in our retail and office centers. And so our ability to unlock that excess land for higher density residential development, basically infill development in parking lots, is absolutely available. So we're working right now on both commercial properties as well as excess land with churches where, again, they're going online, they need less parking, and unlocking that for affordable rental as well as ownership.
Joel, Ted, anything to add there?
I think it would be fairly easy to kind of minimize office buildings, especially if they have plate heights that would accommodate subfloors for all your plumbing. So that could be a retrofit done very easily. On the thought of accessory dwelling units, the overall density of the United States, take out a few locations, is 2 units per acre by the time you throw the commercial land in and the public use land and et cetera. But we're seeing an absolute increase in density across the country today because of costs. Builders have learned now that they don't have to build from left to right, that they can actually build from front to back, and they can build more 2-story products. So the density of single-family lots has increased dramatically over the last really just 5 to 8 years subsequent to the housing crisis. So I see that 2 units per acre going up ever so slowly, but it's very real. Our standard size lot today is probably no more than 50 feet wide across the country. 10 years ago, it was probably 65 to 70. It's that dramatic a shift.
Joel, just as we try to wrap up, you're actually building a new community. What do you think about this whole question of size of lots? Is that changing in your developments?
Not marketably. We have standard production size lots for publicly traded home builders. We have a different array of lots for manufactured housing, which is extraordinarily high quality. By the way, just to comment on retrofitting office buildings to residential, I did that 20 years ago in downtown Phoenix before anybody lived there, and it absolutely created an opportunity for people to live in was exclusively an office area. But back to your other question with our community, I'm actually extraordinarily optimistic, and going back to what Wendell Cox said, I don't think we can change policymakers. I don't think we can change the media, but that's shouldn't be our focus. We have, I speak to, I have 5 kids and I have all their friends and they're all millennials. They're all 21 to 27-year-old kids. And if you get away from asking about policy as it's presented by the media and ask them what it is that they want and how they see their future, it is absolutely what all of us are trying to provide: a reasonably priced home that's safe, that has openness, that they can be near their family. I mean, there's not a kid I talk to that doesn't talk about being near their parents or their grandparents and having their grandkids being involved. All of those things are what we spend our time as developers paying attention to, and it's our job just to not convince or not try to persuade these buyers who are out there that public policy makers in the media is sending them some nonsense, because they already know it. They know what it means to them if they save $2,000 a month on their payment, their monthly payment. Policymakers argue about a $15 minimum wage. When you save $2,000 a month on a standard 2,000-hour work year, that's a $12 an hour increase in your wage. You don't have to worry about a minimum wage. You've just increased everyone's income or take away by $12 or more. So I really am optimistic about the millennials, the kids, middle-class Americans, different ethnic groups. They are instinctively, they know this. They're not studying Paul Krugman. They know where they want to live.
Well, look, I don't think I could have ended that on a better note. I want to thank all the panelists, the audience. We've got great questions. Some of them I know Cullum and others are answering. So I'm going to turn it over to Charles to wrap up. Charles?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you guys see me? Is my video on?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all the attendees for coming and taking part. I thought it was a great conversation. We're going to be editing the video and posting it on our social media as well as on YouTube and distributing it to our panelists. So look out for that. And I want to, as Joel just did, thank the panelists, Cullum Clark, Ann Snyder, Pete Saunders, Carla Lopez Del Rio, Wendell Cox, Joel Farkas, Mark Boyce, Ted Nelson, and obviously thank you to Joel for moderating both panels and being a warrior through that. And thank you to Tom for kicking us off this morning. We really appreciate him opening up the conversation. So if you want to find the report, you can go to urbanreforminstitute.org and you can find it there. And you can also sign up for our newsletter there if you so choose. And I'd suggest you visit bushcenter.org as well, who partnered with us for this report, and they have a lot of great information and a new report themselves. So again, we'll be sharing this on our social media and on our website, so I hope you'll check it out. But until next time, thank you all for participating and thank you for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you.